there are a couple of really important points to keep in mind when we're talking about media convergence. And the first point to keep in mind is that it's not a particularly difficult concept to get your head around. So the idea of media convergence, try not to overthink it in our discussions, both here and in the workshops. Now, the reason why I think media convergence is not a particularly difficult concept for the majority of you to understand is that it's really the media environment that you've grown up in, that you've come of age in, or that you most intimately know. So media convergence, the idea of media convergence, is something that comes naturally or will come naturally, and you should be able to understand quite naturally because you live media convergence in your everyday interactions with media technologies, media products, and media content. So at its most basic level, media convergence simply refers to the blurring of boundaries between different elements of the media system and the interaction between those different elements. So what we're talking about is the coming together, quite literally using that definition of convergence, the coming together of media technologies, media content, and media industries. And what I want to do now is demonstrate the idea of media convergence in a little more detail by looking at some of those more specific examples. So let's begin by talking about technological convergence. Technological convergence is absolutely connected to the rise of digital technologies. So when we talk about technological convergence, what we're talking about, what we're referring to, is the increasing significance of digital or computer technologies for creating, distributing, and exhibiting media content. And one of the really big things that technological convergence allows us to do, or one of the big things that it does for us, is that it blurs the boundaries between content creators and audiences. So in a pre-convergence media environment, so think about a media environment where digital media, where social media didn't exist and you only had television stations, radio stations, and the print media industry. It was very difficult, if not impossible, for non-professionals to create their own content. And it was indeed very difficult for audience members to speak back to or engage in conversations with the media. Now, thanks to technological convergence, seen most dramatically, I think, through social media, the way we use Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram, and all of those platforms, that boundary between content creators and audiences is now blurred. And obviously, the most dramatic and the clearest example of technological convergence is the smartphone. So think for a moment about all of the things that your smartphone brings together and allows you to do. So in many respects, for a large percentage of us, the fact that you can use your smartphone, your mobile phone, as a telephone is pretty low down on the list of things that you can do with it. So you can send text messages, you can take photos, you can record videos, you can do a whole range of other things that once upon a time were only available in separate and distinct devices. So that's technological convergence. When you want to think about a definition or an understanding of technological convergence, think about your mobile phone. think about your mobile phone and what it can do. So it's a GPS device. It's not only an image recorder, so it not only takes photos and videos, but you can edit them in your mobile phone as well. It's a small personal computer and does many of the same things, if not all of the same things that your laptop or your desktop can do. So the mobile phone, the smartphone, is kind of the archetypal example of technological convergence. Our second example of media convergence is content convergence. So here we have different forms of content coming together. And I've got some examples here. So we could look at the sporting industry and the development of sporting content as a really good example of media convergence. So if you're into football or soccer, many of you will be aware of the Manchester United TV logo on this slide. So that is a premium television channel that's both available on pay TV and online as a streaming service that is created by the Manchester United Football Club. So obviously it deals with Manchester United specific content, and a large number of football teams in the UK and throughout Europe have these sorts of content-specific, team-specific channels, as do increasingly in Australia. You will see Cricket Australia producing its own content for the web. You'll see a lot of AFL and NRL, so Australian rules and rugby league teams, producing team-specific content, as well as sort of at a broader level, the national bodies producing content as well. So locally, in the NRL, the National Rugby League, the Brisbane Broncos has its own newsroom. So it has a team of journalists, content creators of various sorts, social media people, videographers, writers, producing Brisbane Broncos specific content. Reality television, in many respects, really couldn't exist without the idea of content convergence. So a show like I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here relies on the internet for people voting to get rid of or vote off various celebrities, and we can do that with SMS as well. So the internet, SMS, those ways of communicating really allow reality television, or some forms at least of reality television, where the audience votes to keep certain members of the group in or out of the show, literally could not exist without the internet, SMS, or at a broader level, telephone. So back in the olden days, and I'm talking about the year 2000, when Big Brother first was released, you could phone in as well to vote people off. Again, lifestyle television, kind of an offshoot in many respects of reality television, relies on the convergence of different content sectors. So if you watch The Block, if you watch My Kitchen Rules, if you watch MasterChef, you'll see a very, very close connection between media companies and the retail sector. So product placements, specific sponsorships of various programs and various segments. And I think a really good example of this kind of content convergence, in relation to media companies in the retail sector, are the free Coles and Woolworths magazines that you can pick up at the Coles and Woolies checkouts. These are free. Realistically, You know, they contain lots of good recipes, lots of good ideas for meals, but they're essentially, you know, glossy ads, or at least advertorials. Now, the really interesting thing about the Coles and Woolies magazine is that they are the most popular magazines. They are the most widely read magazines in the country. They're free. They're really just, you know, extended advertisements, but they're extremely popular. And I think they're a really good example at a quite, you know, at a quite kind of old school level, because we're talking about print media, examples of content convergence. Our talent shows, so X Factor, Australia's Got Talent, etc., and the connection between those shows and record companies, where various winners and popular performers go on to record, you know, record albums, release music through deals with record companies, is another example of content convergence. And, you know, for the music industry, in an era where the importance of radio as a way of breaking new artists is, you know, quite significantly reduced to what it was maybe 20 years ago, finding alternative ways of getting new performers in front of audiences is a real challenge. So these shows are very useful for the recording industry. Now, just before we move on, if you're beginning to think, well, you know, some of the you know, definitions we're talking about here are a little bit leaky. So, you know, in some respects, if content convergence, or some aspects of it at least, sound a little bit similar to technological convergence, don't sweat that too much, because convergence, by its very nature, the idea of things coming together and the boundaries between various elements of the media blurring, is kind of a natural byproduct of the concept. So, you know, don't overthink those kind of moments where you think, is this an example of technological convergence? Is this an example of content convergence? You know, those boundaries are indeed a bit slippery. And if you're thinking that, then I would say, and certainly encourage you, to think in terms of your understanding the concept. So that's a good thing. Now, I want to now talk about the third example of media convergence, and that is the idea of industry convergence. And I've got two examples of industry convergence here. The first one is Telstra, which is Australia's major primary telecommunications company. Now, Telstra, once upon a time, used to be owned by the government. So it was a public service. It's subsequently been privatised, and as part of that privatisation, we've seen what Telstra does expand quite significantly. So Telstra not only owns the telephone lines, the cables and signaling devices by which we can make phone calls, it also subcontracts them to other companies such as Optus, such as Vodafone, such as TPG for the internet. We know that you can go into, in any shopping centre, a Telstra store where you can buy phones. So, you know, it's not just about the cable, the signalling, it's also about the things that you use to make calls. We know that Telstra is part owner of Foxtel, the pay TV company. We know that Telstra runs Big Pond, which is an email service. So that idea of industry convergence, I think, is quite clearly demonstrated in Telstra as a local example. Now, Netflix is a really interesting one because Netflix originally in the United States was only concerned with distributing content. Now, originally, believe it or not, Netflix was a mail order DVD rental service. So you would actually use the internet to order a DVD, to rent a DVD, which Netflix would then send you, and then you would mail it back once you'd watched it. Obviously, once technology allowed it, Netflix became a streaming service, a content streaming service, so you could access content via the Netflix website or via the Netflix app. So historically, we've kind of thought of Netflix as a content distributor, but on the back of the success of that role as a content distributor, Netflix has become a very important content producer. So not only does it distribute content, but we know now that Netflix makes content. So again, that's another really significant example of industry convergence in action. So Netflix's transition from a content distributor to a content producer as well.